One of my favorite techniques for strengthening mortise and tenon joints is the drawbore joint. The drawbore joint is a very ancient technique that goes back at least to the 16th or 17th century, probably later. And it is a way of strengthening a mortise and tenon joint so that it remains sound over a long period of time, even after the adhesive has expired, if any adhesive was used at all. Essentially, drawboring is first, with the joint disassembled, drilling a hole through the thickness of the mortise. And then you reassemble the joint by placing the tenon into the mortise wall, marking its location, removing it, and then drilling this hole offset so that it's a little closer to your tenon shoulder. Then, when you reassemble the joint, either with glue or without, and you drive this wooden peg, this oak peg, through the joint, it snakes through and pulls the tenon shoulders tight against these mortise walls forever. The first step in drawboring is to drill a hole completely through the mortise walls, through both sides. In thick work, you can stop the hole so that it doesn't go through the whole piece. However, you really want the hole to be as deep as possible. In thin frame construction, such as a door or a face frame, I generally recommend you just drill all the way through, both sides of the work. The inside of your piece is generally not going to be a showpiece, meaning it won't show, and so you don't really have to worry about what it's going to look like on the inside. And the next step is to insert your tenon, which I'm going to do now, as it's going to sit in your finished work. Now, something that's sort of interesting here is, look, most power tool woodworkers, and even a lot of hand tool woodworkers would call that a pretty sloppy fit. It wiggles just a little bit, left to right. There's probably a 30-second gap. That would be unacceptable for most people. For drawboring, that would be better fit than you need. So here we're going to do it in this joinery example with a less than perfect mortise and tenon joint. So with the tenon inserted in the mortise and held firmly against the mortise walls, I take the same brad point bit that I used to drill the hole and simply place it in the hole and give it a little twist. Not much. Remove the drill bit, remove the tenon, and then I'll usually put a little mark on the hole so that you can see where it is, especially in coarse-grained wood such as ash, which this is, and oak, and where your mark can sort of be difficult to see. The next step is, once you have determined where that hole would be, you need to move the center of that hole in towards the shoulder to provide that mechanical interlock that we discussed. The real question of how far to move that hole is something that you need to be mindful of. If you use too little of an offset, say you moved it only a 30-second in, then you would produce a joint that really doesn't have much of a mechanical interlock at all. You would lose all the advantages of these extra steps. If you put too much of an offset, say 1/8 of an inch or more, you would absolutely self-destruct your peg as you drove it through your work. So you need to settle on an offset that's usually somewhere between 1/16 and up to 1/8 in some extreme circumstances. Exactly what offset you use is determined by the scale of your work and the species of wood. Now that the offset has been marked on the tenon, is to put the 1/4-inch brad point drill bit back in your drill and to drill straight through at the offset location. I like to do it on a piece of waste so you don't blow out the tenon cheeks unnecessarily, though with this technique it really doesn't matter. And then I'm going to simply reinsert the tenon into the hole. and check my offset. And indeed it is. I can see that it is offset. The next step is to make the peg that will draw these two together, and that involves a couple green woodworking techniques and your pocket knife. You want a peg that has the grain running straight through it from one end to the other. That gives you the strongest peg possible. So what I'll do is I'll line it up with my line. It's very simple, with just a pocket knife. Take my hammer, another great use for a nice hammer. Two whacks, and I have a kind of, little peg. Now, you're going to drive it through a dowel plate. This is a commercial one, made by Lie-Nielsen Tool Works. Or you can make your own by boring a hole through a piece of steel. The nice thing about a commercial dowel plate, either new or antique, is that the holes are drilled in such a way as to make it all very easy. They're not just straight through. There's a slight taper to the hole, a relief angle, if you will, and it makes the cutting action a lot easier. So I take the dowel plate, I place it over one of my dog holes, and then I taper the end of the peg with my knife. This is going to be a 1/4 inch peg, but it's too big to fit through the 1/4 inch hole, so I'm going to drive it through the 3/8 inch hole. Then drive it through the 5/16 inch hole. And then in the end, we have a 1/4 inch perfectly straight grained piece of white oak that will pull that whole joint together.